Hello everyone, and thank you again for joining us for this year's Charles K. Wilkinson Lecture Series. My name is Michael Seymour. I'm an Associate Curator in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art here at the Met, and it's my honour to introduce our next speaker, Professor Michael Harrower. Michael Harrower is Associate Professor of Archaeology in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Johns Hopkins University, where he's also Director of SRSAH, the Spatial Observation Lab for Archaeological Research. He received his PhD from The Ohio State University, and his research is concentrated on the long-term histories of civilizations in Africa and Arabia. He's a specialist in geographical information systems, GIS, and satellite imagery mapping, tools which have increasingly become fundamental to archaeological research and which he's used to focus on questions around the spatial, political, and ideological dynamics of water, and most recently on ancient trade. His fieldwork in Oman and Ethiopia has included a NASA-funded study of long-term water histories using a combination of archaeological survey and satellite imagery analysis. In Oman, his work has involved a wide-ranging archaeological survey along with satellite imagery mapping of copper and chlorite resources, production, and trade networks. In Ethiopia, his work has concentrated on long-term settlement patterns, in particular through his excavations at the newly discovered ancient Aksumite town of Beta Samati. It's that last topic that we'll be hearing about today. As you'll hear, Professor Harrower's work at Beta Samati has had a major impact in several areas, including the insights it can offer about interactions over time between East Africa and southwestern Arabia. It's a fascinating project, and we're so grateful to Professor Harrower for graciously sharing his research with all of us. So with that, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Michael Harrower.
Hello, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm so pleased to be here, and it's just such an honor to be invited by the Met to give a presentation for you today. And delve into some of our recent research. So I'll be speaking today about ancient Ethiopia and its connections with other parts of Africa and the Near East in general. I want to start by just saying that my heart goes out to the people of Ethiopia. There's been a conflict going on for about the past year that's really heart-wrenching and distressing to watch, and one can only hope that there's peace and reconciliation and a negotiated solution to that forthcoming, as soon as possible. We've been incredibly fortunate to be welcomed by the people of Ethiopia. And this picture here in the green hill that you see is the ancient town of Beta Samati. And we were guided to this area by local peoples in 2009 who were reporting this place of historical importance during our archaeological survey work in the area. And this is very near a town called Ndagaruba, which means Wednesday market in the local Tigrinya language. And these pictures here are from the market day at Ndagaruba, very lively center point of activity. So I'm going to be speaking today about a number of areas. And it's quite notable that a lot of archaeological research, quite rightly, is focused on these major center points of grand ancient civilizations like Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Eastern Mediterranean in general. And far less is known about a number of other regions, including sub-Saharan Africa, Arabia, and many other parts of the world. This map shows you a variety of different archaeological survey projects that really sort of depicts the really tiny sort of window we have on the geography of ancient Aksumite civilization. So two areas we'll be talking about: the Eastern Archaeological ETAP, which is just north of the modern city of Adigrat, and then the SRSAH project that's here in orange near the ancient town of Yeha. This stands for the Southern Red Sea Archaeological Histories Project. So these are two exploration projects that I've been involved in over the past 15 or more years. It's notable as well that although archaeologists think about these ancient civilizations like Egypt and Mesopotamia, Indus Valley and others sometimes as being independent cases of the rise of civilization, there is, in fact, a lot of evidence for interaction, even between Mesopotamia and Egypt, and certainly between Aksumite civilization in Ethiopia and contacts with ancient Egypt, with ancient Arabia, and even Nubia, the topic of our presentation earlier today. So one of the most grand and notable aspects of this ties into ancient Egypt, the Queen Hatshepsut's expeditions to the land of Punt. So archaeologists and historians have debated exactly where the land of Punt is, whether it's on the Arabian or African side of the Red Sea, really for many decades. But most agree that this land of Punt refers to both Arabia and Africa. We know that maritime expeditions down the Red Sea began very early on, even in the third millennium. And by about 1500 BC, when Queen Hatshepsut ruled, this famous queen, and it's really a proud moment to be giving a presentation for an institution that is home to some of the art shown here of Queen Hatshepsut, this seated statue that's on display at the Met. Hatshepsut was quite famous for a variety of reasons, not least of which this construction of this impressive temple at Deir al-Bahari shown here, which is a major point of tourist interest. And inside the temple at Deir al-Bahari, there's depictions of these maritime voyages. So really extravagant construction of these vessels that were sailing down the Red Sea at a very early time, interacting with people in this land of Punt. And this is prior to the development of Aksum, the capital city of Aksum, and Aksumite civilization as we know it, but falls within this period we refer to as the pre-Aksumite. So what was Hatshepsut so interested in? Well, gold, frankincense, obsidian, exotic animals like elephants, baboons, leopards were being brought back on these expeditions. And this really fueled the prosperity and the highlighted the grandeur of her rule and of her leadership in organizing these major voyages. Now, this is, of course, happening long before we know the pinnacle or apex of Aksumite civilization, which starts in the last century BC. And Aksum is well known for these monumental stelae in the stele field here, up to nearly 100 feet tall, coinage, including this gold coin shown here, and glass and many different types of ceramic pottery that are well known, also traded in imports from the Mediterranean and also locally produced vessels. And these stelae surmounted royal tombs, some of which are shown here. So that's really quite an impressive repertoire of art and civilization. In terms of the timeline, we know, just to give you a basic idea of the chronology here, that archaeologists have long referred to this pre-Aksumite period that starts out about 800 BC. That's traditionally the timeline here. Then we get into the Proto-Aksumite, early, classic, middle, and late Aksumite, and then eventually the decline of Aksumite civilization. So the big questions here for any ancient civilization are what factors precipitated the rise of Aksumite civilization, what contributed to the decline and collapse of Aksumite civilization. Recently, there's been some incredibly pioneering work done by a Canadian professor, Catherine D'Andrea, a mentor of mine, that pushes the dates for the pre-Aksumite well back into even the time of Hatshepsut in the middle second millennium BC, and also Iris Gerlach at an important site called Yeha. This German team working there has been coming up with material from the second millennium BC around 1500 BC. So we know more exploration is definitely going to reveal a deeper timeline here of the early civilizations. Traditionally, what we know about pre-Aksumite period has been really contributed to by this important site of Yeha that's dated to the 7th century BC, this impressive temple of dry laid stone. This is a temple to the god Al-Makka. It's really quite stunning, and German and Ethiopian work here has gone a long way to kind of stabilizing the walls. As you can see here, they're quite vulnerable. This picture was taken back in about 2005. Really an amazing construction and filled with some impressive inscriptions and iconography. Here are these ibex frieze, which would have adorned the upper walls of this temple, incense burners like this one here depicting the crescent moon and full moon god Al-Makka. And these ancient South Arabian inscriptions tell us some important details about the rise of iconography. So the major debate here revolving around the origins of pre-Aksumite civilization pertains to the relative local and global influences. Clearly, we have some South Arabian influences here, and early scholars talked about an Ethio-Sabaean civilization. They talked about this Sabaean civilization from what is today Yemen exerting an important influence in this area. But more recently, archaeologists have come to recognize that a lot of the pottery, the material culture, the architecture is really locally derived, and that the pre-Aksumite period can be pushed much further back into the second millennium BC, around 1500 BC even. And that really what we see here is probably local elites, local rulers co-opting some of this religious traditions, this paraphernalia, even the script, to bolster their local authority, their local prestige. And this really contributes and gives rise to pre-Aksumite and later Aksumite civilization. So about 10 years ago, a little more, I started a project called the Southern Red Sea Archaeological Histories Project. I'd had a fortunate opportunity to spend a long time working on the archaeology of Yemen, is quite interested in the Southern African and Arabian part of the Red Sea. And our endeavor really involved some exploration in this really rugged landscape you see here surrounding this important, well-known site of Yeha. And this is Dr. Jacob Bongers, one of the participants in this team who really played a key role. And we conducted an archaeological survey. This was funded by NASA for a satellite imagery and exploration-based survey that ran from about 2013 to 2017, in which we used a variety of types of satellite imagery mapping, on-the-ground GPS mapping to really kind of reconstruct the geography of these early civilizations surrounding the important site of Yeha, as you see here on this map. A lot of this work involves really a keen eye towards small bits of artifacts like this small obsidian microlith here. And of course, the discovery of Beta Samati shown on this map, it's about an hour and a half to a 2-hour walk north of the town of Yeha, was also really pivotal. So I'll be going into that in some detail. I'm also going to talk about our sort of settlement pattern analysis and show you quite a number of graphs. So I know one of the big advantages of Zoom is that we can reach out to many people in different corners of the world. The disadvantage being that your attention is competing with me and with all sorts of other things you have on other windows on your screen. So I'll keep this brief and try to give you a sort of summary of some of our settlement pattern work here. Some of this dates back to central place theory. So even in the 1930s, a geographer named Walter Christaller was looking at human geography and trying to explain the number, location, and size of human settlements. So he predicted that human settlements in a otherwise flat and homogeneous landscape would tend to form a hexagonal lattice work. And so you'd have cities, towns, market towns, and villages laid out in sort of a lattice work hexagonal pattern. I often explain this to my students in some ways as if we think about the geography of the United States, we could look at what are the largest cities. So New York, Los Angeles, Chicago. Why are these certain cities located in certain areas? Why are some larger than others? If we didn't know about the politics of the current politics of the United States, we might, from an archaeologist or geographer's eye, think that these large cities were, one of them was the capital city. But of course, we know that's Washington, D.C., not necessarily New York or Los Angeles. But this is the type of work that archaeologists are doing, looking at the layout, the distribution of cities, towns, villages. And one of the longstanding hypotheses about these posits that once we hit a 4-tier settlement hierarchy where you have cities, towns, villages and hamlets, let's say, that this is an indicator that you've reached a state level civilization. So with collaboration with a statistician, Carrie Priebe, at Johns Hopkins, we've been considering this for the ETAP area and the SRSAH area. And these graphs are showing you our analysis of whether there's a 2, 3, 4, or even up to 8 tier hierarchy. So to go through this relatively quickly, what it's showing you is that the sites don't necessarily break down into these clear-cut categories, that there's a lot of sites strung out along a continuous distribution of sizes, and there's not clearly one that stands out, especially in the early times of the pre-Aksumite period. We also look at the distribution or clustering, and one of the measures we can use for that is Ripley's K cluster analysis. So to summarize this down in a simple way, we might think about, are the sites uniformly distributed? Are they clustered? Are they dispersed across an area? And if they're clustered, what does this tell us about the politics of the past? Of course, we don't have the window into the politics of the past that we have today with our media and internet system. So we've got to use some other bits of geography to try to reconstruct this. And we can draw circles around areas and count the number of points or clusters in a radius to get a sense of this. And this gives us a graph like this with the, if this red line is towards clustered, or this red line dips down towards dispersed, at different scales, we can see clustering or dispersion of archaeological sites in an area. So without belaboring this in too much detail, we can look at the ETAP pre-Aksumite, Aksumite, and post-Aksumite periods and look at where are the sites clustered. And then in another area, our SRSAH archaeological survey, again, we can look at clustering and dispersing. So your eyes might be rolling a little bit trying to understand what's really depicted here. And I can show you a map that depicts it in a little bit of more intuitive way. These hotspots are the clusters, and the blue spots are clusters that are just not quite as dense. And for the ETAP project, we see clustering during the pre-Aksumite period. So one of the ways we try to interpret this is thinking about, are these settlements becoming the center points of politics, of authority, of control of trade routes or agriculture? Are they exerting influence like New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago might be influencing in modern times in the United States? We look at the Aksumite period for the ETAP project. So there's really strong clustering, these red hotspots in the pre-Aksumite period. And then in the Aksumite period, we see population increasing, but the political authority sort of being more dispersed across the landscape. So there's not these bright red hotspots. There's smaller clusters of towns and villages strung across a landscape, and lots of infilling. And then by the late Aksumite period, we really get a drop off where you don't see clusters. The clusters that are there are really small. You see a population decline and a really decline in political authority or centralization. So as Egyptologists might talk about intermediate periods where the Egyptian civilization declined and there was less centralized authority, this is sort of the equivalent of that in Aksumite civilization, where you see a degeneration of the political authority. For the SRSAH project, the only period we have clustering is during the pre-Aksumite period. So you've got some really red hot clustering around the site of Yeha and around this site of Beta Samati that I'm going to talk about in the moment. So this is really what archaeologists become really captivated by, is, are these clusters telling us something about the political hierarchy? Are they telling us about political heterarchy, the distribution of power amongst different settlements and towns, and the control of trade goods and political decision-making? One of the areas I'm really going to focus in on that tells us a lot about the long-term change amongst pre-Aksumite and Aksumite civilization is the town of Beta Samati. To give you a sense of a size, the way I explain this oftentimes to my students is in measuring it out in terms of American football fields. So this site is about 20 hectares. That's about 40 American football fields. So if you think of American football fields being 100 yards long, 50 yards wide, this would be about 40 of those. So it's large. It's, might even fall into the category of being considered a city by ancient standards. Some cities were quite small, but really by a modern standard wouldn't be considered a city. But depending really on the activity there and the density of material, which we're just getting a sense of. And thus far, we've only had the time to excavate in two different areas, Area A and Area B, and I'll be talking briefly about those today. So the first excavations of Beta Samati were conducted by Jacob Bongers and I in 2011, and we really didn't know exactly what to expect. There's lots of stone on the surface. We know Aksumite architecture is routinely constructed with this local stone, and lots of pottery also on the surface, but we didn't really know what was in store for us underneath the ground. And the local villagers were incredibly gracious in helping us start work at this site, and incredibly interested in what we were working on. And this area here shows our first trench excavated at Beta Samati in 2011. And I said to Jacob, well, X marks the spot. I must be marking the spot here because we've just under the surface, we came across this intersection of walls, which makes an X kind of shape. And one of the ways we can understand the chronology here, even from this small excavation, is to look at the distribution of artifacts. These red dots are all things we've collected here, and then look at the sequence in terms of wall construction. So there's wall A, there's wall B, and then later on there's wall C. And if we try to get a sense of the timeline of that, we can take some radiocarbon dates here. And one under the trench of wall B gives us an age of around 600 AD. This shows you a further exploration of that area in 2015. So here's our wall A, B, and C. And what this was really important in revealing to us was the planned nature of the architectural layout, so that wall A actually continues to a much larger area and creates a number of different rooms. And this suggests to us that this is a planned layout constructed simultaneously. So it wasn't one room or one house, but really what appears to be a courtyard area and a number of different buildings here that we've recovered evidence of metal and glass working, food storage, processing, and consumption. A mogogo griddle, which is used to make injera, the quintessentially important part of Ethiopian cuisine. It's like a flatbread made on a mogogo. And also evidence of coinage and even some evidence of an infant burial here, giving us a window into the lives of the people occupying this area in the past. Also, coins are really important in giving us a sense of the history here. So we've got a variety of different coins that came out of Area A. I'll talk a little bit more detail about this silver coin of King Ezana, dated to the 4th century AD, but also 5th century AD and later early 7th century AD coins of King Arma are really important bits of the timeline here. One important part of the history of Aksumite civilization surrounds this important Aksumite king, King Ezana of the 4th century BC, or 4th century AD rather. And King Ezana, his coin here reads Basilius Ezana in Greek. So this gives us a little sense of how the Aksumite kings were tied into a globalizing world that connected to the Mediterranean, and we're using Greek, clearly a foreign language, to write the mottos on their coins. And also up here at the top of this coin, you see the crescent moon symbol of the South Arabian god Makkah. And we know that King Ezana here first denoted these coins with this crescent moon symbol, and then later this was replaced by a cross denoting King Ezana's conversion to Christianity, and really an important pivotal moment in Aksumite history. So of course, Egypt has the Rosetta Stone. The somewhat more modest and less famous example of that in Aksumite civilization is this trilingual inscription written in Greek, Sabaean, which is a South Arabian language, and Ge'ez, the liturgical language of the Ethiopian church. And so this describes the exploits of King Ezana, his conversion to Christianity and conquest of the kingdom of Kush and city of Merowe in Sudan. So this is a really important kind of monument that depicts to us some of the important historical events and King Ezana's real efforts to highlight his prowess in conquesting other areas. And this extends to military expeditions into Arabia and into Sudan. Another really important part of Beta Samati is the Area B excavations, where we revealed a basilica. And this is really at the very earliest end of churches known from sub-Saharan Africa, and very few are preserved in a way that can be subject to modern archaeological excavation. So it's really an important monument that way. We originally encountered this building. We didn't know if it was a temple or a palace or some other kind of building. It could have even been a mosque, potentially, because if it was a little bit later in time, it would have spanned into early Islamic civilization. But eventually our excavations in 2015 and 2016 revealed that this was in fact a basilica with a stone paved floor and copious evidence of amphora that were traded down the Red Sea, containing liquids, possibly olive oil or wine, incense burners and crosses, and a number of bull's head figurines and other zoomorphic figurines, and also coinage. This is a map of the tripartite layout of the basilica. So exterior recess and rebedded walls that are typical of Aksumite construction, and a rectangular rather than apsidal sanctuary suggests that this is on the very early end of basilicas. And indeed, radiocarbon dates place this in the 4th century AD, making it arguably amongst the earliest basilicas constructed in sub-Saharan Africa. Also really giving us a window into this building is a Guise inscription that was found, and this was examined by Alessandro Bassi of the University of Hamburg. And this inscription quite revealing in that it says, "For or to this entrance, Christ be favorable to us." So this was really exciting for us to get this quite definitive evidence about the Christian use of this church. Also revealed were a number of crosses. This ivory cross, pendant, and bronze cross, and incense burners with crosses paint a picture of the early religious life at this basilica. Long distance trade. So these amphorae that we know were being produced in the Mediterranean and being brought down, a Millefiori glass bead, African red slip terra gelada. So this is a important type of pottery found throughout the Roman Empire. And also wheel thrown pottery that we know is also an import, gives us a sense of the connectivity of this basilica and the town of Beta Samati with other areas in the Mediterranean. These amphora really are an important part of this. These are the fragments. These are fragments of amphora, but this is what this vessel would have looked like in a complete way. And we know at Beta Samati, the proportion of these amphora fragments really reaches a very high level, even higher than some of the excavations at the capital city of Aksum revealed. So we know there was quite copious connections here in terms of trade down the Red Sea and up to the Mediterranean. And also this softstone pendant was found. This was subject of a lot of study and debate by Alessandro Bassi and others on our team. So a Christian cross on the left-hand side, but these enigmatic inscription here has been translated as reading venerable, where the cross is not written and instead is represented as an actual cross. So basically this is saying the cross is venerable, or indicating the importance of this as a Christianity-centered object. And we can compare this with some of the early manuscripts were recovered near the modern city of Adwa at these so-called Garima Gospels that are an important window into the early religious life of this region. Amongst the most sort of stunning in art historical and aesthetic sense of our finds at Beta Samati is also this gold intaglio ring, which is really interesting as a collection of different iconography that's local to the region, with the composition of a gold and electrum bezel. So this is a carnelian centerpiece with a bull's head and vine below it. This is somewhat reminiscent stylistically of Roman era rings, but the iconography here being very different and more African than what we see in rings in the Mediterranean. So it gives us an example of the important local influences in terms of art and traditions, combined with some of these global or interregional influences coming out of surrounding areas. If we think about the concluding remarks here and what we could devise as a summary to the trajectory of Aksumite civilization, we know that this newly discovered town of Beta Samati was a major center about an hour and a half walk from Yeha, where activity concentrated through this important period from the 7th century BC to the 7th century AD. We know that the rise of complex polities during this pre-Aksumite period, which now some projects are starting to push back to as early as 1500 BC, remains a topic of a lot of debate. But clearly, contacts with Egypt, Sudan, and Arabia undoubtedly play a role, as do the long trajectory of local settlement, local agriculture, domesticated crops like teff, the use of oxen and cattle for plowing and whatnot. So it's a combination here of locally derived religious traditions, ideology, and politics, with some interregional influences coming out of places like Arabia, Nubia, Egypt, and throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Our settlement pattern analysis here, scrutinizing this area from the eye of a geographer or from the purview of satellite and air photo evidence, indicates that really we've got locally aggregated political organization during the pre-Aksumite period. So these hotspot kind of clusters give us an idea of people aggregating together around a large town, of the organization divided into these larger growing agricultural settlements that become the basis for later civilization. So we see a lot of these important pre-Aksumite towns like Beta Samati have continuity into the Aksumite period, which gives us a sense of there not being a radical disjuncture or break between these two civilizations. The Aksumite period shows locally decentralized organization, interestingly enough. So we have the capital city of Aksum exerting control over a really massive area, including Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, parts of Yemen, and intermittently parts of Sudan. So while that capital city is exerting its influence locally in the ETAP region and SRSAH region, these two areas that I've concentrated on today, we don't see a centralized or clustered local outposts. We see decentralized organization while population is really growing dramatically. And we have infilling of a lot of little hamlets, villages, towns through and via this population growth. And then in the post-Aksumite period, we see a pretty rapid decline in population and political centralization, so that this Aksumite influence seems to dramatically wane. We don't find sites. We see people scattering out into smaller villages and hamlets, and the declining influence of the capital city over this northern part of Ethiopia, and indeed in other areas. Why Aksumite civilization underwent such a rapid decline is not clear, and requires a lot more scrutiny by archaeologists and historians to really understand how this unfolded, when it unfolded, and why. But potential reasons include climate change. So we're getting into this era of the warm period that may have influenced settlement, land degradation. So things like deforestation, overgrazing of areas are acute problems in semi-arid parts of the world, including in Ethiopia in recent times. So this could have also played a role. Declining influence or control of long-distance trade. So Aksum was critical in adapting its control of not only trade out of the central parts of Africa, but also control over trade coming through the Indian Ocean and up the Red Sea. And that seemed to have dramatically waned during the late Aksumite and post-Aksumite periods. And also quite tragically and sadly, war, which seems to be a hallmark of a lot of ancient civilizations. And how this relates to things like climate change and conflict over trade routes and whatnot is a topic of a great deal of interest. So I'd like to finish off by thanking the many funding organizations and institutions that have been connected to this research: UCLA, National Geographic, of course, NASA, Aksum University and Adigrat University, the Archaeological Institute of America, not least, of course, Johns Hopkins, my home university, and all the people that have taken part in the Southern Red Sea Archaeological Histories project. It's important also to note the federal government Authority for Research and Conservation of Cultural Heritage that have given us permission to do this research and been so greatly helpful in facilitating our work, and also the Tigray Cultural and Tourism Bureau that has been really pivotal in helping us understand this area. And not least, of course, is Aferam Wareda, the local municipality, and the village of Ndagaruba, the people shown here who are really part of a large effort to understand the geography of this area and to understand the ancient town of Beta Samati. We're so grateful to them for facilitating and collaborating in our research. Thank you very much.